Hello and a warm welcome to all you avid quiet rioters for this week's main show, recorded fashionably late so we could drink in any drama from the Tory leadership speeches. Spoiler alert, drama there was none. And also, indeed, mostly because we all needed a little bit of sleep, having stayed up overnight to watch Captain Smarmy take on Sergeant Everyman in the American vice presidential debate. Deep joy.
Hello too from me, Kenny, your producer and stand-in for Naomi for this week only, I promise. And stupendously bleary-eyed from watching Vance and Waltz as well. Let me give a special shout out to one Quiet Riot listener who I know also stayed up. Take a bow, Peter T, who tweeted furiously about the lack of interest in the debate, writing that his feed had received only 3 messages on the subject, one from Elon Musk and 2 from, and I quote, some prick called Kenny Campbell who I don't even know. The joy of the Quiet Riot clan is that we both immediately realised this was very much a blue-on-blue incident and kept each other vaguely sane for the remainder of the debate. A big thank you, Peter, from that prick, Kenny Campbell.
So, on this week's show, we will be discussing that somewhat vanilla vice presidential face-off and looking askance at the Tory leadership latest too. One topic we are not covering is Keir Starmer's meeting with Ursula von der Leyen. And before Naomi teleports back to quite legitimately inquire WT actual F, we're holding off on that face-to-face until I can get some intel on Friday from my regular Brussels group Zoom, some actual insight, if you please, and we have Naomi back in the chair, because it just wouldn't be the same without her.
Indeed, I wholeheartedly agree. Our guests this week are Quiet Riot favourite and UK Director of More in Common, Luke Tryl, Quiet Riot favourite and UCL Associate Professor of Global Politics, Brian Klaas, and, drumroll, Quiet Riot favourite and self-confessed haunter of The Guardian, Zoe Williams.
Hello, Zoe.
Hi.
Welcome again. So, listeners, spread yourselves on a convenient chaise longue. Reacquaint your tongue with some peeled grapes and luxuriate in this week's Quiet Riot. The word on the streets of Devon, where Kenny sometimes loiters, is that he has found a fabulously butch new hobby. Clickety-click, Mr. Campbell.
I know not what you mean, Mr. Andreou. What is this clickety-click of which you speak? Death Watch Beatles?
Oh, come on now. Don't try to pull the wool over my eyes. You've become a knitter, haven't you?
I prefer the term knittist. Okay. Shout out to my friends Pete and Shan, who are absolute rocks when you need an absolute rock, and they're also very, very big fans of the show. And they've accidentally introduced me to the way of the woolly ball. Well, Shan has. Pete is more football than woolly ball.
What gorgeous garment are you creating? A chunky Aran sweater, a timeless bobble hat, a sexy little tank top to impress the girls and boys of Devon?
Well, it was more of a rectangle, and then it was a square, and now it's kind of a blue-grey rectangle again. I'm making a scarf, I guess.
Zoe, do you knit?
I have done in my life, but my problem with knitting was always that my hands weren't clean enough. So
clean?
Clean. No, clean enough. So if you knit when you've got like congenitally dirty hands, everything ends up the same colour.
You know, I know how to knit as well, weirdly. We are 3 knitters. What are the chances? So my mother was teaching my 2 sisters how to knit, and I was excluded because apparently it was a completely unsuitable activity for a boy. So what did I do? Of course, I stayed up all night for several nights under the duvet with a flashlight and a magazine that taught knitting and taught myself to knit. And when I was found out, I got a royal smacking from my dad.
Really?
Yeah. And I think that's basically the first clue they had that I was gay.
Anyway, enough knitting stories. Let's talk Tories.
Anything you can do, I can do better. I can do anything better than you.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can.
Now, the Conservatives gathered in Birmingham for their annual party conference, and the atmosphere, according to most who attended, was infinitely more chipper than a historic election defeat 3 months ago might have led one to expect. Certainly, there appeared to be not a hint of reflection or apology. Quiet Riot regular Luke Tryl was in attendance. His organisation, More in Common, has done some tantalising research on what the Tory party needs to do to rebuild itself, based on some really surprising polling. I spoke to him on Wednesday. Hey, Luke.
Hi, Alex.
How are things in sunny Birmingham?
Well, despite the rain and the wind, the Tory mood is a bit sunnier than you might have imagined, slightly weirdly, for a party which just suffered its worst defeat in electoral history. There's sort of buoyancy to the mood at the conference, and perhaps a little bit of what you might call over-optimism that Labour's recent struggles might see them back in power sooner than they thought.
Your latest research is all about the path to rebuilding the Conservative Party, effectively.
Well,
So you found some, I would say, pretty counterintuitive stuff, not to me or to you, but certainly to the general wisdom within the party faithful about which voters the Conservatives need to win back.
Yes, absolutely. As you know, there is this sort of big debate in the Conservative Party about which group of voters they chase first, which group of voters that they lost they try and woo back, and which is the greater priority. And you will have seen that a lot of the noise and discussion coming out of the conference was that it should be reform voters that the party focused on. I think, activists, some commentators really want to win back that reform vote. But what our polling showed was that reform voters might actually be the hardest group for the Conservatives to get back. We asked in our poll different types of voters who the Conservatives lost. When might you consider voting Conservative again? And the interesting thing is that reform voters, only 1 in 10 of them said they would consider voting Conservative again this Parliament. For Liberal Democrat voters, it was actually 1 in 5. And for Labour switchers, people who left the Tories for Labour, it was 1 in 4. So what our research says is that if the Conservatives were being, we think, particularly savvy, they would take a 3-phase approach. And actually, they wouldn't start with switchers at all. They would start with Conservative voters who reliably vote for the party, who basically stayed at home this time. They were so cross with the Conservative Party that they decided not to go out and vote. And crucially as well, and I think this gets a bit ignored when people analyse how well Labour did, they weren't scared enough of Keir Starmer to go out and vote. So they, and that's a triumph of Labour strategy there, because this group are not habitual non-voters. There's always this sort of debate in politics, can you get non-voters out? And it's very difficult. This group, if you look at them, of those who voted Conservative in 2019 and didn't vote this time, for 3/4 of them, it was the first time they ever hadn't voted. So they are normally reliable Conservative voters. So getting them back is the first step. And how do you get them back? Well, when you ask that group, what does the Conservative Party do at its best? It is sound economic management first, standing up for Britain second, and law and order third. And I think we can both agree that during the last Parliament, the Conservative managed to at least project that they were failing on all 3 measures, particularly economic management when it came to that mini budget. So that's step 1. Step 2 then is you've got your base back.
Can I ask you something, Luke?
Of course.
How do you, because this is the conundrum always for opposition, isn't it? How do you prove that you are better at those things when you're out of government?
Well, I do think some of it relies on the government making missteps. I think the Conservatives can be as effective opposition as they want, but if Labour runs a perfect game and runs the board, then, Labour will be re-elected. But I think to take out, and this is what Keir Starmer did, right? Keir Starmer benefited from Tory missteps. But the reason that he was then able to take advantage of that and ultimately end up in government was because people saw the Labour Party was serious. If you looked at they actively junked some of the proposals, which on the economy meant people were a bit worried that they were going to spend too much under the Corbyn proposals. They repudiated the past. I think the Conservatives are going to have to think very hard about what they say. Look, we did this before, or we pledged this before. Actually, that was a mistake. And it was interesting, despite lots of the talk at conference about making mistakes in government, there wasn't that sense that they'd identified 2 or 3 policies that they were going to say, you know what, we did that wrong. But I think that's a prerequisite to winning back that economic competence point.
Yeah, there was generally, I thought, a lack of reflection, actually. There was a sort of great looking forward, but I think when you've just come off the back of that election, there needs to be a little bit of an autopsy.
You can't look at the future without looking at the past, looking at precisely what went wrong and, having a proper autopsy. I don't think it's good enough simply to say we got immigration wrong, right? I mean, that, you can look at any opinion poll and it tells you that breaking promises on immigration went down badly with people. But there wasn't that digging into, for instance, was it wrong to say stop the boats entirely because it raised expectations so much? Was it wrong to make Rwanda the be and the end all when something like the Albania returns deal actually was making progress? That there was a striking lack of that. And I think that's necessary both for what we call phase 1, getting back those normally loyal Tory voters, and phase 2, which is winning back Labour and Liberal Democrat switchers. Interestingly, 33% of those who voted Labour, having switched from the Conservatives, now say they regret it. Now, whether that will hold, I don't know. But, that should be the low-hanging fruit for the Tories. Mm-hmm. They've got to convince that group they've learnt the lessons about why they lost them in the first place. And then our research basically says, look, if you've done 1 and 2, if you've got loyal Conservative voters back, if you've got some Labour switchers, some Lib Dem switchers back, you start to look competitive again. And then you can say to Reform voters, you've got a straight choice. It's a Labour government or a Conservative government. The last election, there wasn't a straight choice. Everyone knew the Conservatives were going to lose. People go vote Reform. Because the interesting thing about Reform voters, I don't think this will surprise you, but it's the extent of it is quite striking. They really don't like Labour. In fact, they are around 7 times more likely to say they preferred Rishi Sunak's government to this current Labour one. But they're not going to come back. And I think this is really crucial. They're not going to come back by the Conservatives trying to outbid Reform, because you will never be able to. You can't outbid Nigel Farage on net zero. You can't outbid him on immigration because he'll always go further. And crucially, lots of Reform voters are very different to the Tories. Tory voters massively disapprove of Donald Trump. Reform voters don't. Tory voters support Ukraine. Reform voters are much more split on it. It's very difficult for the Conservative Party to just think like Lego bricks. You can add the two together. So I think that what they've got to do is get those other voters back on side, pitch to Reform. And they won't get all Reform voters back, but there are some Reform voters are very similar to the radical right we see in Europe, and it is very hard to reach them. I think they will keep voting for a while for populist right parties. But there's another group who I think the Conservatives or Labour could win back, actually. They're basically just disillusioned with the system, with the status quo. And I think that group, the Conservatives, and this is what our data shows, they should be targeting them. So it's not about choosing particular voters, but it is about the phasing and how you present yourself.
Quiet, Riot. So, spoilers. This was part of a much longer and juicier conversation on the future of the Tories under each of the 4 possible leaders that we will be putting out on Friday as a bonus episode. But the polling sets us up well to discuss the speeches.
Zoe, last time we spoke to you, you said, and I quote, "You are enjoying the relaxing feeling like a warm bath of not giving a fuck who becomes their next leader." Is this still your view? Have you mustered a little bit of excitement now that it's down to 4?
I've slightly revised my view.
Okay.
Which is, I still don't give a fuck. I'm fascinated by their tactics. I'm fascinated thinking through how they arrived at them, like what nexus of influences they have. I think Kemi Badenoch especially has a lot of American think tank influence. And I'm fascinated by the perversity of trying to appeal to the Tory membership and what it takes these days.
Did you watch any of their sort of short pitches or bits of them?
Yeah, I did watch them. I mean, Kemi Badenoch, obviously all of them have done a lot of pitch rolling ahead of their pitches, so they've said these extraordinary things. I don't think Jemrick wanted his now we have to kill people instead of interrogating them because of the I don't think that was pitch rolling. I think that was just a weird thing he said a year ago in which some mischief maker is just dragging out. Kemi was definitely pitch rolling, and her pitch is, I'm going to be as unpleasant as I can possibly be, and I'm going to fluff it by denying I said it. Now that is extraordinary. There are huge swathes of the political class in which to deny outright that you said a thing which you did say is disbarring from the rest of public life. So she's singing to a different hymn book, I think, and I'm interested in it. I am interested.
She was the only one that I think made no attempt to claim that they had done anything good during their time in office. She sort of just wrote the whole thing off. She basically pretty much said that it has been Blairites in charge of everything for the last 30 years. And I find that really just quite extra. I found her language also a little bit, do I want to say the F word? It was a little bit fash adjacent, let's just say. Stuff like rewire, reboot, reprogram.
Yeah.
That sounds a little bit Communist Party of China to me. This stealthy poisoning of our country must stop.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it was just, there was some really quite striking stuff.
We will rewire, reboot, and reprogram. Nothing is more exciting to me. I am an engineer.
Look, it's not completely novel if you remember Liz Truss, which tragically we all do. She was often making these points, like there was this kind of, third, what do they call it? A fourth column, a third column, a column.
Deep state.
There was this deep state involvement, which every single idea she had that went wrong, it was because of the deep state. And every single idea she had that went right, well, that never happened. So but
you're such a cow.
I know, right? But it's not completely. I suppose what's sad about it and what speaks to the dishevelment of our political culture is that I wasn't that surprised. I've heard very similar things from Truss. I have in the past heard things that gave me the chills from Priti Patel. It's very scary hearing in real life rather than in GCSE history somebody make those bare assertion arguments that everything they did were actually destined for success, except they were subverted by the deep state. It's chilling, really. And I think it is part of a playbook where the right has steadily, and I think this is a 30-year job, appropriated the language, its analyses, the tropes, the imagery of the left, of the hard left, turned it against us and just keep winning with it, So whether it's taking diversity arguments and saying, well, I can't be racist because I'm a black woman, whether it's taking conspiracist deep state arguments and saying all of our ideas failed because of this, whatever it is, it's borrowed from a kind of 70s, 80s left and really turned inside out and against us.
Yeah, what I wanted to ask both of you is, she was plainly aiming her words to the base, right? To the membership. But the next stage are her peers. Will what she has said alienate a little bit her peers? Might some of them think, we like how combative she is, But this sounds very much as if she's just going to pick fight after fight after fight, and it's going to be exhausting.
The thing is, it's exactly like a party membership selectorate has really dissolved in something really peculiar. All she needs to do is get past Tory members now. When she comes out of that, she can be whoever she wants to be.
Yeah.
I hate to say it, not too dissimilar a way that Keir Starmer just had to get past Labour members, and then once he got through it, was the person he wanted to be. So I don't know if you saw Tim Bale's research this week. He did at Queen Mary's. He's done a deep dive into party membership and how it differs from the general population. And the Tory membership is diametrically opposite to the rest of the population of what they call the dark triad traits, which I'm sure you knew what they were. I didn't know what they were. But the dark triad traits are Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. So they had a number of statements like a leader needs to be strong and sometimes manipulate to get his own way.
Yeah.
I like a leader who's aggressive. I like a leader who knows who he is and is confident. And basically in the general public, they were disagreeing with those statements. 48% of them were disagreeing and 28% were agreeing. In the Conservative Party membership, 48% of them were agreeing and 27% of them were disagreeing. So
it was inverse, basically.
It's absolutely inverse. They are the opposite to you and me. They're not people that are even trying to be centre ground. They are out and proud, dark triad trait people. Through that light, if you look at the Tories and the way they're talking, Jenrick, Tugendhat, they're all, even though Cleverly comes off as much more sophisticated, they're all talking in this kind of very aggressive, martial, violent imagery, whereas Kemi is a little bit different. She's just going for anything people prize and think is good, I'm going to attack it. So whether she's saying civil servants should be in prison or whether she's saying, hang on a sec, it was her who said civil servants.
Yeah, it was. Or 5 to 10% apparently. Nothing excessive, just 1 in 10.
Or whether she's saying maternity leave. She's basically prowling the terrain of unsayable political remarks and saying them, and then getting out of it by saying her words have been taken out of context.
The point you make is a very important one about the language being employed, because, of course, it's dragged people like Tugendhat and Jenrick, Tugendhat in particular, I suppose, into almost that trap. I mean, some of the things that stood out for me, Tugendhat talked about, a new conservative revolution. Jenrick talked about building a new conservative party. The only one I thought had nailed it briefly was Cleverly, when he said, let's be more normal. I thought, hang on a second, that's going to appeal to the electorate in general. But then he broke everything because he said, don't let anyone trash a record, be proud of a record.
So let's be more like Reagan. Let's be enthusiastic, relatable, positive, optimistic. Let's be more normal.
Cleverly stood out of the four, in my view. I mean, if I were Labour, I would be most scared of James Cleverly, I think, because there is something about him that is quite everyman and quite relatable. He's very comfortable talking to the media, giving speeches. And I found it very interesting also that he's the only one that had any element in his speech of a need to look at what went wrong.
Exactly.
All the others were like, the last 14 years never happened, the last election never happened, we're moving forward and somehow magically we will recapture power in 5 years. And Cleverly was the only one that was saying, we lost our way, and we let people down.
I know, but you're still dealing in old money, right? You're still dealing with...
I mean, they are the Conservatives.
But you're dealing with you're dealing with a party that is speaking with half of its face to the conference hall and the rest of its face to the rest of the population. And that always used to be our understanding of how party political conferences worked, that you would parse their meaning for the bits that were for the faithful and the bits that were for the normal. and the sophistication of how they balanced and married those two messages was always cause for kind of some congratulation and cheer and celebration, right? That's the old way. That's how we used to do party conferences. But now they are not going for the general population. And you had Stephen Bush on Twitter saying they should so obviously choose cleverly, and the fact that they're completely messed up is the fact that they won't. You had Robert Peston saying, cleverly just fired a broadside across Kemi Badenoch's bow by saying that civil servants were valuable servants of society, which used to be quite a normal statement, such as he wouldn't have had to say it. We're evaluating and adjudicating and ranking them by old rules. They're not playing the old rules. Even the ones who are normal spend a lot of their time trying to sound like, Thanatonic.
Still within their envelope, as it were. With the party, what it is at the moment, and the four people who they are, I thought some of them exceeded expectations and some of them performed well below. So I thought Cleverly did shine by virtue of others being terrible. I thought Jenrick was the other way.
The choice before us is leave or remain. I'm for leave. I'm for the country. I am for the country of Magna Carta, of the habeas corpus, of the Bill of Rights, defending our own freedoms and liberties. I am for finishing the job that we started with Brexit and restoring to our people and our Parliament its sovereignty. So under my leadership, the new Conservative Party will stand for a new Great Reform Act, one that leaves the ECHR, repeals Tony Blair's Human Rights Act, and writes a British Bill of Rights.
Genuinely, one of the most uncomfortable things I've ever seen. He was like one of those Japanese robots where the AI is not quite sorted yet. That someone had fed him the 20 favourite things of Conservative Party, and he just kind of went, Margaret Thatcher, yay!
I mean, look, I think Jenrick has... I don't think he's that clever is the problem. So he does wrong foot himself constantly. I think a huge amount of his most controversial output is accidental. There are some things he says that are deliberate, but he never correctly anticipates where and how they're going to land. He's like a drunk pool player. You can see he meant to pot the white, but surely not there. I don't think he has either the cojones or the IQ to be the person that he wants to be, which is the guy who speaks to the deepest, darkest Tory.
And that's why I find quite weird how much of a favourite he was going into the conference and how much hype there was behind him and how much support he had from his colleagues. He's just a slightly belligerent duty manager at a Premier Inn.
Yeah. Well, come on then, witches and wizards of politics. Get into your crystal balls. Which two are going to get through?
Oh,
which ones are going to get through to the members?
Yeah.
Because MPs vote next.
In that case, I think a lot of MPs are going to want Cleverly.
Yeah.
And a lot of the crazier MPs are going to want Badenoch. So I'm going to go Cleverly Badenoch, and then Badenoch's going to get it.
Yeah, I think Tugendhat is out first. His speech really did not hit the right mark at all and got a very lukewarm reception. And I think once he's out, quite a lot of his votes transfer to Cleverly, which means Cleverly then sort of leapfrogs into the top two, and it's then between the two right-wingers, as it were. I wonder if there are enough votes to play with. I wonder if James Cleverly would much rather go up against Robert Jenrick than Kemi Badenoch, and whether something might happen there that excludes Badenoch from the final two and makes it a contest between Cleverly and Jenrick.
If you think of them as two completely discrete constituencies, right, I don't think MPs have got anything in common with the members anymore. I just don't think anybody does. They want to put in front of the members the least bad version of what they think the members are going to go for. And I think they probably would think Kemi was less bad than Jenrick, just because she's better at it.
Yep.
Race is the big elephant in the room, though, I feel, because that particular selectorate, it's very to the right on a lot of issues. Do we think they are ready to vote for a black woman?
They absolutely love performing their non-racism with selective non-racism for one person, just as they absolutely loved it with Thatcher. You know, I'm very old and I can remember conversations in the Battersea Labour Party where people were going, they'll never go for her, she's a woman. But they were like, they absolutely loved it. It was mischievous, it was counterintuitive, it was a winning strategy. They loved being able to put somebody in front of voters and say, and promulgate what were in fact extremely sexist, backwards policies with a woman at the face of them. And I can really see that with Kemi.
One last question on this topic then. How long do you give this particular leader, whoever it turns out to be?
Oh, that's a good
That
question.
that really does depend, I think, on how Labour do. Because, you know, there are stage posts on the way. There is Welsh, Scottish elections, local elections. There will be a few by-elections inevitably. And so it is those stage posts that kind of determine how the leader of the opposition does. If they are seen to be making progress against Labour, they tend to get more time. If they seem to be going backwards, the Conservative Party can be quite ruthless at not even letting them go to one general election, as they did with Ian Duncan Smith, wasn't it?
That's right.
So it really does depend on whether Labour can get its act together, I guess.
Well, now there's a question.
Yeah. Right. Call to action this week. Please support the work of More in Common. They've produced a great report trying to suggest some sensible stuff to the Conservative Party. Most of it will be ignored, but it still acts as ammunition for those within the party trying to anchor it to something resembling centre-right European politics. And they have produced an equivalent report for Labour as well, and all of it is based on really good research and polling and focus groups. So we'll drop the link to the website in the show notes.
Quiet Riot.
Now, it's time for our newest feature, Grin and Share It. It's the most quiet, rioty feature we do at the moment, and you all seem to really have taken to it. It's time for a good news story, and heaven knows, this week of all weeks, we really need it. What have you got for us this week, Alex?
I was reading a story in El País about Denver's attitude to asylum seekers, undocumented migrants, and their integration. And it really is quite extraordinary. I will drop a link to the piece in the show notes. You may remember that in an act of sort of revenge, I guess, for the number of migrants coming over the border, Texas started busing them to basically cities in other states that have a democratic leadership.
Yeah.
In a sort of see how you like it.
All right.
This is Governor Greg Abbott. He would just pile a bunch of them in a bus and send them to New York, send them to, in this case, Denver, Colorado. While Chicago and New York took quite a restrictive attitude, imposed strict limits for staying in shelters, they basically struggled with the whole thing very badly. Denver took the exact opposite approach. 215 families, 865 people. And Denver made the decision to use the 6 months that they have to wait before they can apply and receive a work permit to house them permanently. So they gave them normal accommodation, a house to each family for 6 months, because actually that worked out much, much cheaper than accommodating them in hotels and shelters, and also having to feed them in restaurants because they could prepare their own food, and to use those 6 months to give them English lessons, put the kids in school, and in addition, they had direct contact with various employers in sectors that had the greatest demand, so say hospitality or care homes, construction. They used those 6 months to train people intensively in whatever one of those they chose. And the system has been just a huge success. And I just thought, I'm getting a little bit emotional now, actually. I just thought it was just a brilliant example.
That was very, very uplifting.
Quiet Riot.
There's a special breed of politics nerd, a particularly hardcore politics nerd, who will put themselves through all manner of torture to stay in touch with the chosen subject. Well, in the wee small hours of Wednesday morning, these tortured people tuned in to watch Republican J.D. Vance do battle with Democrat Tim Walz in the US vice presidential debate. Now, as Alex noted in his midnight mass on the debate, and I promise you, Alex's thoughts are far, far more engaging than the debate was. It was a couple of hours that none of us will ever get back. But it was significant. It was significant because it may well be the last televised debate of the campaign since Trump has pooped his big pants over facing Harris again in front of the cameras. The pollsters said the face-off was pretty much a draw, with Vance perhaps a gnat's chuff ahead. But remember, pollsters can only poll weirdos like us who actually watch these debates, and we are so not a representative sample. With that in mind, we decided to talk to someone who might actually be able to shine a bit more light on what happened.
So I spoke to Quiet Riot regular and one-man US desk, author, UCL politics professor, and Minnesotan Brian Klaas. Here's what he told me. Hey, Brian.
Hey, it's great to be back on the show.
Brian, I have never seen such starkly different opinions about a major debate, I think, ever. And I get the impression that this was not just driven by partisanship. And I say that because my view wavered between quite extreme conclusions and sort of has continued to brew after the end of the debate and still now. What did you make of it?
Well, I think what was most striking about it is what it tells you about the campaign's goals. Because normally when a campaign views itself as being down in a race, they come out swinging and they try to provoke each other. And the sort of comparative cordiality, and I'm not going to sort of make this sound like it was a wonderful and uplifting experience to watch the debate, but compared to the vitriol of American politics over the last 7, 8, 9 years, it felt a tiny bit normal.
Yeah.
And I think that is an indication that both campaigns, for whatever reason, did not want this debate to change the narrative of the race. And I think that both of them probably got their wish because effectively, I think the race is fundamentally the same as it was a day ago.
So they were desperate not to lose rather than to win.
People vote for presidential tickets based on who the president will be. And normally the vice president either shores up support in an area of the country where they're weaker or offers balance in some sort of demographic characteristic. But it can cause you problems. So John McCain's pick in 2008 of Sarah Palin was a liability for him. And I think that what you look at with a lot of the VP debates in the past is that if you do think you're up in the race, you basically don't want there to be a lot of news. And the risks for both J.D. Vance and Tim Walz was that they made a mistake that basically overshadowed the top of the campaign. And of course, J.D. Vance's stuff around the eating the dogs and eating the cats stuff did trickle up to Trump in the presidential debate. And it's, I think it's been a political liability for him. So, you can have problems that derive from the VP candidates, but by and large, the evidence seems to suggest that these debates do not move the needle very much when it comes to undecided voters.
Mehdi Hasan was really angry at the sort of mild approach that you describe, at the sort of more collegiate tone. He thought that Walz should have pounded Vance on his lies and the stuff he said. Childless cat ladies didn't come up at all. Springfield came up, but not the ridiculous specific lies about Haitians eating pets. So I can see his frustration, but I wonder, does he misunderstand the brief a little bit? Because sometimes the things that might gratify us as partisans most might not be the best vote-winning strategy for wavering people or independents.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that critique, but I also think that, first off, it's very difficult to know what sways undecided voters, because one of the things we have to keep in mind, I think this is central for understanding the role of the VP debate this late in the race, is that most of the people who don't know how they're going to vote didn't watch the VP debate. Because most of the people who don't know how they're going to vote are people who do not care about politics very much.
Yes.
So, you have all these political junkies arguing about this stuff and all these political junkies watching it. And in fact, the late breaking aspects of this race are going to come down to people who basically don't care about politics and might be swayed the morning of the election. And so in that realm, you can make the opposite argument that for those people, Tim Walz seeing like an affable, above the fray, very likable figure could be helpful. And the problem is we don't know. You can make a compelling case that Tim Walz could have gotten more political mileage out of skewering Vance, making news out of the debate, and having that dominate headlines for the next few days. And you could also make a compelling case that actually the fact that Tim Walz's favorability ratings are through the roof in modern American politics is a good thing for the Harris-Walz ticket. And sometimes marketing, what they'll do with marketing is they'll do A/B testing, right? Well, they'll try one version of an ad and they'll try another version of an ad and see which one works. You can't do that in presidential campaigns with debates, right? You only have one version of Tim Walz. And so we don't know which one would be more effective. And so you end up with people on the left saying he didn't go aggressive enough, people in the middle saying he was very affable and so on. And nobody really knows what would be a better strategy. It's impossible to know.
Walz's favorability ratings actually shot up after the debate even further. I've seen two polls. One puts him at an astounding 59% approve and another on 60% approve. And this was after a debate that he is seen by many to have lost on some metric. I watched the whole thing. I would say Vance was dominant. He was more agile. He pivoted better. He was leaner in his arguments. He didn't ramble. And yet, Walz comes out with better favorability ratings. And that reminded me a little bit of Al Gore versus George W. Bush in 2000, wasn't it? Where Gore was seen to have won the debate definitively, but W walked away more popular.
Yeah, so I think we talked about this on a previous episode I was on, where I think that a lot of professional political analysts misunderstand the electorate because they believe that the electorate views politics the same way they do, which is where you win arguments by having better facts and making appeals to policy ideas and so on. The average voter in America cannot tell you a detailed account of what Medicaid is. A lot of politics is impressionistic. What you're really doing is trying to create what I call schemas, what are called schemas in the psychological literature, these sort of impressionistic labels that stick to individuals. And I think this is where Vance's biggest liability exists, is that the schema of weird, which is where, Walz coined this idea and popularized it, that's what's really hurt him. It's kept his approval ratings underwater. Yeah. Is that he's sort of this just strange, childless woman obsessed, happy to morph his political views for opportunistic reasons. Like, that's the impression that has kept his approval ratings low. Whereas, Tim Walz has successfully become the schema of America's dad. It's not a sophisticated or rational way to analyze politics, but it also is something that actually cuts through to voters. And so I think you're right to draw the parallel with Gore and Bush, that Gore was listing 5-point plans and he was polished and he was ready. And yet he came off slightly robotic and slightly unlikable. And Bush sort of, had that aw shucks persona that he really lent into in his presidency. There's some of that going on here too. And I think my one thing that I will argue in favor of the sort of Mehdi Hasan critique is that if you got under J.D. Vance's skin, he has an ugly side to his personality, which they didn't provoke as effectively as they could have.
You say that. I was reviewing the debate and I was trying to find bits to slot into my overnight review. And it was very difficult to find quotable bits of Vance. Because he was so even-tempered, he didn't get passionate, he didn't get punchy. And I wonder whether, considering the afterlife these things have now on social media, the vast majority of people will just see clips of things that circulate for the next few days. And actually, Walz has walked away with some very good clips, especially around the January 6th stuff. And I can't find a single viral bit of Vance that reflects positively on him. Is that part of the calculation nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, before I started watching clips of the debate after the fact and so on and seeing what was filtering through to social media, I looked at various headlines as well, and they were either completely neutral. I mean, the New York Times original headline was the epitome of neutral. It says like Vance and Walz clash over how to improve Americans' lives, right? I mean, it tells you literally nothing about the debate. But the ones that actually sort of framed things were talking about how Vance refuses to acknowledge that Trump lost in 2020 or minimize January 6th. And the meme that I saw circling a lot in Democratic circles on the internet was where Vance
the fact
checked, right?
Yeah.
Where they sort of say we should note that the Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, are legal immigrants, and he says, "Hey guys, you agreed not to fact check," which is like, it's not a great look to say, "Hold on, guys, I may be telling a lie, but you promised you wouldn't call me on it." So yes, I think that those things will cut through in a way that some of the Vance clips won't. Fundamentally, though, I think the problem for these debates from the campaign's perspective is more that there's a significant risk of making news the wrong direction in the closing stretch. And they were both sort of playing defensive. I mean, Vance loves debating. He thinks that he's, very clever at debating and all this stuff. And so he was going into it ready to hold his ground. And by all accounts, most people agreed that he did pretty well in terms of the stylistic aspect of the debate. But I just don't see the person who has encountered Donald Trump since 2016 in all his craziness, in all of his, felony charges and January 6th and all these things, and says, the thing that's now going to cause me to vote for him is JD Vance's debating ability. And I think what it tells you more is that both campaigns think that they're in a safe position, which is a very odd position to be in, because one of them's wrong. And we don't know which one's wrong, but both of them did not want this debate to change the narrative of the race.
Fascinating. I wonder what's going on in the Trump camp as well, because what J.D. Vance presented to me was precisely the sort of establishment metropolitan Republican that Trump has been railing against for years. He really reeked of old-style Republican slick debater. And there were a lot of comments online from right-wing people going, Trump should shut up for the rest of the campaign, just let J.D. Vance do the talking. And so I wonder if actually that won't land very well with a narcissist like Trump, whether there's a part of Trump that will have wanted Vance to fail.
Yeah, there's a few things I'd say about that. First off, I think that you're right that Vance comes off as more polished, establishment slick, as you say. I don't think that's what the base wants in the Trump camp. I think they like the larger-than-life persona of Trump. And this is one of the huge discussions that's about to be unleashed if Trump loses, is does Trumpism outlast Donald Trump? Because you normally have, and you're right to point this out, that you sort of, even when you articulate a Trumpist agenda, it doesn't sound Trump-like if it's packaged in a normal standard political format like J.D. Vance presents. And it's less appealing to voters. This is the great sort of magic that Trump has brought to American politics in a way that I loathe it, but I think it's a political skill, is that he can say things that are genuinely very cruel, very crude, and somehow come off as this sort of, according to his base, likable rogue, right? I mean, then people make comparisons with Boris Johnson the same way. And when you have the sort of straight-laced politician just say the same policies, they sound mean, and they sound establishment, and they sound unexciting, basically. The Trump campaign is more worried about J.D. Vance being shown to voters because he's like a tailor-made weapon to turn women voters against Donald Trump.
Yeah.
He's so off-putting in the way he talks about politics, especially when it comes to issues that have gender divides. And so this will be a historically divided gender vote where the margins that Trump will run up among men for him to win will have to offset historically large margins for Kamala Harris among women. I think that Trump regrets picking Vance. I think that he thinks he was a mistake. And I also think that the VP pick has always been something Trump has not wanted to do. And if he had the choice, he would not have a vice president, because Pence was the same. I mean, it's like Pence is not made for Donald Trump. I mean, he's like the establishment politician, a religious evangelical leader of the old Republican Party. At some point, it doesn't work. So that's I think the other issue is like, how will this government work if Trump does get elected? But I think Trump doesn't really want anything to do with J.D. Vance if he could avoid it.
You're right, I think. I think Trump hates having to share the ticket with anyone.
Yes.
Okay, final question, very quickly. Where do you think the election more generally is at the moment?
Well, I always hesitate to make predictions because
Minnesota has opened, right? Early voting is going on.
It has, yes, indeed. I've got my ballot actually sitting next to me, and I'm about to cast it, send it in the post office later today. I think the thing that I would say about my gut feeling about the election, and I could be very wrong about this, so we'll see how this looks on November 5th, November 6th. I think that the polling is underestimating the turnout model in a post-Roe v. Wade, post-Dobbs decision environment. You have these samples within polls that say, oh, Trump is down by 1 or up by 1 or whatever. Okay, that's close. But what if they're off in the turnout model by 3 or 4%? I mean, that's a much bigger deal because that's millions of people who aren't being counted basically within this polling universe. And if their models are off in the who ends up showing up, that will be a polling error, I think, in the Democrats' favor. And that's what happened in 2016, to my mind. The polling was broadly accurate, but they misunderstood how many people who were new voters would come out to vote for Donald Trump. And I suspect there'll be some new voters that come out to vote for Kamala Harris. So my gut instinct is that if the election was held today, she would win by 3 or 4 points. But there's a month to the election. As we're speaking, a war might be about to break out in the Middle East. Like, a lot of things can change.
Yeah.
But right now, I would rather be Kamala Harris's campaign than Donald Trump's campaign.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, actually.
Yeah. Well, the one thing I'd add to this that I think is useful for thinking about this race, and this, again, it's my gut feeling, is that we can sort of think of 4 possible outcomes, right? A big Harris win, a narrow Harris win, a narrow Trump win, or a big Trump win. I would not be remotely surprised if there was a big Harris win, a narrow Harris win, or a narrow Trump win. I would be shocked if there was a big Trump win. And I think that tells you a little bit about the race because he hasn't tried to cater to people who didn't already like him. He hasn't tried to win over Democrats in any way whatsoever. And so I think the pathway to him winning by 5 points is non-existent. I think the pathway to him winning exists. And I think the pathway to Harris winning by 5 points is realistic too. I wouldn't be remotely shocked if she won by more than the polls suggested, whereas I would be significantly shocked if Trump won by 5 points.
Brian, thank you. That is illuminating as always. Look forward to having you in the studio soon. It will be an exciting month ahead, won't it?
Yes, well, and hopefully not horrifically depressing. Thanks very much, Alex. Talk to you later.
Zoe, you watched most of it. What did you think?
I watched it all. I just drifted off at the end. When Walls is stumbling and uncertain, it is uncomfortable. It just is. His inexperience shows sometimes. You're rooting for him really hard. It's really painful. You know how much it costs him.
He's a panicker. He's a bumbler.
And he's got a really nice folksy way of dealing with it, but you still wish it hadn't happened. So I'm not going to kind of come in here all guns blazing. What I found really distressing about the coverage was that all the American commentators were saying, oh, thank God, a return to civility in politics. Now, that was not a return to civility in politics. You know, Vance was lying a lot of the time. And if Walls is too polite to tell him he's lying or can't exactly find the formulation to say it in a civil way, I don't think that's a win for civility. I think that's a problem. His stuff on abortion was kind of terrifying, I thought.
And also, I mean, his response to women dying because they have to travel 3 states over to get healthcare, his response was, democracy's messy. And it's like, what the fuck are you talking about, man?
Yeah. The abortion issue is fascinating to me because pollsters always underestimate how important it's going to be. And I think the reason is threefold. It's a male-dominated business. They don't realize how important the issue is to women. They just don't think it through. Secondly, a lot of Republican voters are secretly pro-abortion in a very intense way, but don't say so to some random who's called them up. And thirdly, because they've never been in this situation before. However pro or anti-abortion you were before Roe versus Wade was overturned, it really wasn't that material to you. It really wouldn't have made a huge difference to your life whether you hated it or loved it because you had it. And now that that isn't the case, people are galvanized in a very, very interesting way. So you have Kamala's supporters much, much more invested and Trump's supporters secretly get any given household. The mum is either not voting or voting Democrat and the dad is voting Republican. So I think they're underestimating how important the issue is. And as a consequence, they're underestimating it in debate. But it's interesting to me that Vance did feel the need to lie, because I think he's realised that it is electorally toxic.
So Mehdi Hassan, I don't know if you saw, he was livid at Walz's civility and not going at Vance hard enough, not calling out his lies and the sort of appalling things he said. And I have to say I disagree with both of you, because I think the thing that Tim Walz had to protect while he was there was his likability. It was his affability. The image that is built around him, if he goes in there and suddenly he's a hard ass and, nails Vance to the wall, I think that really risks misfiring and destroying his primary characteristic, which is an asset to the ticket, which is that he's likable, he's relatable, he's your neighbor, he's your uncle. You know this guy.
I know, but Alex, right? You're likable, you're personable, you're my neighbor and my uncle. But if I saw you in a debate with Jacob Rees-Mogg and you completely took him apart, I would not find you any less likable.
You wouldn't, but you're not my intended audience.
Yeah, but there's another problem that I had with it last night, and that was that the over-the-top chumminess that we were seeing really helped Vance. It made him look far less unhinged than we know he really is. And he was almost basking in the reflected chumminess and affability that was coming across the stage. And we did see him slip back into his own proper character once or twice, when his microphone eventually got shut off and such like. But from my perspective, I thought that was one of the most disappointing aspects, in that he was able to hide the sort of personal and political character
Molly Young
he really is.
calls it sane washing, which is, I think, a really good term.
Oh, that's a good phrase.
Yeah, it's really...
My impression after watching the 2 hours of the debate was that Vance had very calmly, coldly, calculatedly dominated that debate. When I broke it down to review it issue by issue, I found out that Walz had actually won every issue on the substance. And even more interestingly, when I then tried to find clips, I couldn't find a single clip of Vance that was short and punchy and might go viral and where he looked good. Not one. And it's that afterlife on social media, on the political ads, it is that actually the debate feeds. Very few people will stay and watch it for 2 hours. Most people will channel surf. So there's not a single clip of him that shows him in a positive light. There's just a couple of clips that show him basically still denying that Trump lost the election in 2020, which will be a big, big issue. And then the fact-checking thing, which has already become a massive viral.
Just to clarify for our viewers, Springfield, Ohio does have a large number of Haitian migrants who have legal status, temporary protected status.
Well, Margaret, but
thank you, Senator. We have so much to get to.
Margaret, I think it's important because
we're going to turn out of the economy. Thank
Margaret, the rules were that you guys weren't going to fact check.
That really isn't a good look, buddy. I thought I could talk shit with impunity because no one was going to call me out. Is not a great thing to be saying. So anyway, we will see. Polling is interesting. Very interesting poll here from Politico. Who won the vice presidential debate? Democrats overwhelmingly, 72% to 5%, say Tim Walz. Republicans overwhelmingly, 71% to 4%, say J.D. Vance. Independents and undecideds break for Walz 34 to 25. That's an interesting figure. And even more interesting, Fox viewers gave it to Tim Walz by 58 to 42%.
Ooh.
I think Trump fans really hate him because they can see that Trump hates him. Trump regrets him as a pick. They think he's dragging the ticket down, and they truly loathe him. That's a really interesting dynamic, I think.
On that topic, actually, one of the problems that Vance had from last night was his smoothness. Trump will have hated to see him performing that well. He's such an egotist.
But also, it's absolute establishment Republican. And Trump has spent basically the last 10 years pretty much priming his base to hate people like that. And so slick was the word that everyone was using. But the thing is, I don't think slick does it for Trump's base. I think they like his crudeness.
Yeah.
But we shall see. It's interesting stuff. Anyway, that's a wrap for this week. I have now recorded twice as many podcasts in the last 2 days as I have had hours of sleep, believe it or not. So I'm going to go off and die, but not before thanking my wonderful, beautiful guest, the divine Zoe Williams. Thank you, Zoe.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
And as ever, our heartfelt thanks to you all for tuning in again and helping us reach 500,000 downloads in just 4 months. That really is insane. Quite astonishing. And it's bonkers. And we did the predictions and we talked to experts and we knew how many downloads we should anticipate. And it wasn't 500,000 in 4 months. Thank you all so very much. We're eternally grateful to you all for your loyalty, your feedback, and especially for your positivity, which is very quite rioty as well. And we will be back again with a Sunday School edition over the weekend, as well as bringing you that upcoming Luke Tryl special. What stunning value Quiet Riot is.
If you can afford to support us on ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod, then do leave us a rating and a review and subscribe at your favorite podcast carrier and say something nice about us online. It really does help us with both the algorithm and with advertisers to have as many subscribers as possible.
So bye-bye for now and speak with you again very soon. See ya!
Bye!
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreou and me, Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Cadalou. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Sandstone Global. See ya!
Quiet Riot.
English lessons, put the children in school. Sorry. I mean, what a way to announce to the world that you're a twat.